title of this talk is Evangelical Epicenters and Individual Rights. If you look back over the last 50 years or so in the United States, one of the most basic conflicts has been over the use of public space. Who gets to use it? How do they get to use it? And in particular, how can the public space be used with regard to religion? How do you balance free exercise and establishment and the role of the state to regulate and protect and also afford access to the public space? One of the things that we've observed when we look back at the history of litigation on these issues is we often find ourselves coming back to the American South. We find that prayer issues in schools disproportionately led to litigation in the South. Challenges to the establishment of Ten Commandments monuments on public grounds have been disproportionately in the South. Efforts to affirmatively move forward or express religious history, religious values have been disproportionately in the South. And one of the things that we have to understand sometimes when we go and we take a look at litigation that we have over rights and liberties, when we engage whether or not the Constitution and its values are being served to the benefit of the public and to the protection of the individual, is why things happen where they happen. Okay? Geography becomes relevant to this. Geography is the study of space and place. Okay? And we don't often end up talking about geography when we talk about the Constitution, talk about public law, except when we talk about redistricting, which of course is another talk. But geography matters. Space and place matter. One thing we know about groups and nations is they try and define their space. They try and establish their culture in a space. They try and attract adherents to a space. And then they try and protect that space. Concepts such as homeland or physical nation, globally and historically, have a space component most of the time. In the United States, one of the great benefits that came out of the Constitution was a requirement for a census. And what the census did was it allowed us to collect information about people. And one of the things we got in the habit of doing, because we had this survey since 1790 that went to the public, is we kept collecting more and more information about people. And historically, from time to time, we've even collected information about religions and religious adherents. We don't do this currently, but we collect information about ethnic and racial origin, income, education. We have more refined surveys that the Census Bureau does for the American Community Study that collect information about consumer habits, for example. But we nonetheless still have a great deal of information about religion. The Glenn Mary Foundation does a decennial census of religious adherents. So I can tell you how many Baptists are in Cleveland County and how many Baptist congregations are in Cleveland County, or how many Mormons, or how many Muslims, or how many members of the Assemblies of God Church. And we have these data going back to 1950. So we can paint a picture of America's demography in terms of race and religion, income, just using data, using counties. And one consequence of this is we can actually use statistics to create profiles of communities and use those profiles to understand their politics as well. Two scholars at the University of Maryland, Dante Cheney and Jim Gimple, published a book a couple of years ago called The Patchwork Nation, in which they identified a dozen different community types that there are in the United States. And they actually have a website that you can go to. I believe it's called patchworknation.org, where you can play with their data and look at your community and understand what type they've given it. There are two communities that they have identified that are predominantly religious in nature, two community types in the United States. One is what they call Mormon Outposts, mainly in Utah, in fact most of Utah, but also in other parts of the country, an occasional county here or there in Missouri or Illinois or New York. These are communities with large, if not predominant, populations that come from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The other predominant religious community they identify, the other predominant homogeneous religious community, is what they call the Evangelical Epicenter. Now, Evangelical Epicenters are interesting. Of the 3,141 counties in the U.S., about 15% of them are identified as Evangelical Epicenters, which means that most of the population in these communities are adherents to one of a handful of evangelical Christian Protestant denominations, such as the Southern Baptist Convention. Okay? Of the 475 evangelical epicenters in the U.S., 85% of them are in the old Census South, which is the Confederacy plus Oklahoma and Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. Okay? In 5 states within the evangelical epicenter, over a quarter of the population identify as evangelicals. Oklahoma is 4th among these states. In terms of the number of evangelical epicenter communities. In terms of the percent evangelical population, for example, Alabama is 1st, Oklahoma is 2nd, Mississippi is 3rd, Arkansas 4th, Tennessee is 5th. Of the 100 most evangelical counties in the United States, 41 of them are actually in the state of Oklahoma. So if you were to attempt to find the evangelical epicenter of the United States, you would actually find it in Oklahoma, bleeding into Texas, Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama. Okay? These are the most religiously homogeneous parts of the United States. And what is interesting is that these are also the places where we are most likely to see public policy or public debate that's centered on efforts to defend and define space in the context of Christian faith. If you go back to the 1990s when Judge Roy Moore went to the Supreme Court of the state of Alabama, this was the Ten Commandments Monument judge who put a large granite Ten Commandments monument inside the state Supreme Court. He was elected on the basis of this one campaign promise that it initiated when he had been a district court judge. It led to litigation which he lost. But nonetheless, it was an effort to do one thing, which was to attempt to articulate what Judge Moore and many residents of the Evangelical Epicenter see as being the Protestant Christian foundation of the American nation, the American founding, in an effort to reintroduce those values into the public space. Communities in the Evangelical Epicenter were more likely to have public prayer in school before 1970 and to continue it even after the Supreme Court had ruled that such prayer was mandated prayer in public schools was unconstitutional. But the other thing we see in these communities is we see an effort more recently to engage in public policy that doesn't only go to matters of contextualized Christian expression, but also an effort to potentially limit other expression. Probably the most significant of these was the effort by the state of Oklahoma to institute a state constitutional amendment, State Question 755, the so-called Sharia law amendment, which would have made it illegal in the state of Oklahoma to consider any international law, foreign constitutional law, or religious law, specifically Sharia law, in the language of the amendment, in the proceedings of the courts of the state of Oklahoma. The state of Oklahoma received no small amount of criticism for the passage overwhelmingly of this amendment, which passed with 70% of the vote, and was later struck down in the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals in Denver. But the question that came up in the public was, why would the state of Oklahoma, with 15,000 Muslim residents and no threat of an impending caliphate being established here on the plains, why would they do this thing? Well, it's completely consistent with nationalistic behavior. Nationalists define their space, as I noted before, and will attempt through law, culture, or force to attempt to define and defend their space from encroachments. Survey data in the state of Oklahoma revealed, for example, that majority of Oklahomans think that Muslims worship a different God than Christians. Majority think that Islam is a violent religion. About 40% were actually willing and supported the notion that a public community could limit the ability of a Muslim or a Muslim group to build a mosque or house of worship in their community. Most Oklahomans support free exercise, but a sizable minority were willing to prevent mosques from being constructed in their community. What is interesting about support for all of these statements, all of these opinions, all these policies, including voting for State Question 755, was that it was Christian nationalists that were most likely to support these perspectives. Individuals who had infused their view of the American nation with Christian theology were more likely to put a limitation on or to view as alien adherence to Islam, and willing to use the authority of the state to constrain the ability of Muslims to engage in exercise or to have considered their legal religious traditions through the courts to define a non-Muslim Christian space. The federal courts have been very clear in articulating that such efforts to constrain exercise or to define away a religion by law constitutes establishment, constitutes violation of free exercise. For example, individuals entering into marriage arbitration, if both parties could agree to the use of Sharia law or the use of rabbinical law, if it was consistent with the religious tradition and what they desired. And this opportunity still exists in places like Oklahoma, where Sharia law cannot be banned. But these things happen in the evangelical epicenters. It happens here because these are homogeneous cultures that have infused the national identity with a Christian religious identity, and they find historical precedent for doing so. They find, when they look at the practical command of the moral public space, the moral nation in the United States through the 1940s and 1950s, that Protestant values are preeminent. Many of these voters, who are often older and less educated, have grown up in an environment where it was presumed to be normal, that this was their socialization to American politics. So it's not surprising that if an individual who was a biblical literalist, who held Christian nationalist views, who was not well educated, who did not engage in reading competing literature, would conclude that it's reasonable, if not constitutional, to impose a limited religious doctrine to define the space of the nation, because the nation they've been socialized to, and indeed through the historic acts of the nation, was often Protestant Christianized. This creates a first principles debate and a first principles conflict in American politics, and it's one that sets the shrinking, geographically isolated evangelical epicenters against much of the rest of the nation. It also leads to unexpected outcomes. The litigation that came out of Texas regarding Ten Commandment monuments held that a monument established in historic context did not constitute religious establishment, that if you put up a monument to the Ten Commandments and it was contextualized, for example, as a history of lawgivers, okay? So you have a display about Hammurabi, you take the display out of its religious context, this is a permissible display and a permissible use of the public space. Similarly with religious displays. You can put up a Christmas tree as long as you put up other seasonal religious displays. As long as the public space is available to the religious pluralism, it's permissible to use the space that way. What is not certain is whether or not the state has the authority to refuse displays. For example, we look at a Ten Commandments display. These were gifts that were given to the state. They could accept them or reject them. What of other religious displays? This is the next series of test cases. Can the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster put up a statue? Can Satan worshipers put up a statue? One thing we actually know, this is a funny thing, something we know from constitutional law, is that courts have affirmed that the state has a vested interest in working against insidious evils. Okay? Can this be applied to rejecting a religious monument that is invested not in the concept of good? This will be the argument, and it could be very intriguing. Is it permissible for the state to be vested in a general value set of goodness as opposed to evil, of justice and truth, that allows them to look at a particular set of religious exercises as being anathema to the secular moral norms of the community, and therefore not an acceptable religious display to be put on state grounds? This will be the debate.
Freedom 101 is made possible by generous support from the University of Oklahoma Alumni Association. Freedom 101 is a program of the Institute for the American Constitutional Heritage at the University of Oklahoma. For more videos and podcasts, visit freedom.ou.edu.